and bienvenido to all those who have joined us today. My name is Sarah Kendrick. I work for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I'm a bird biologist in the Midwest region of the United States, and I serve as the U.S. co-chair of the Partners in Flight Science Committee with my Canadian counterpart, Elaine Camfield, who works for the Canadian Wildlife Service. Today's call has simultaneous translation, and we welcome all of our Spanish-speaking partners to our meeting today. Simply choose your preferred language on the world translation icon on your Zoom screen. And thank you so much to Claudia Rangel for our Spanish translation today. We're really excited about today's launch of a new Partners in Flight subcommittee on migration ecology. This subcommittee is really years in the making from a few different avenues within the group Partners in Flight. The Partners in Flight has an Eastern working group, and we here at Partners in Flight Science Committee, we both had independent conversations about a group like this, one that could provide a forum and a community for people tracking migratory birds across the Western Hemisphere to both fill knowledge gaps and also, importantly, to inform conservation action for our declining birds. We hope that this group will share ideas, grow collaboration, and foster international partnerships across the ranges of migratory birds, which our four amazing co-chairs will talk about their vision for the group here in a few minutes. But before we kick off the Migration Ecology Subcommittee, I wanted to share a bit of history with you about the formation of the group Partners in Flight and its broad impact over the last 35 years. I also want to provide brief context as to how a few of the voluntary bird conservation groups across the United States, Canada, and Mexico predominantly, but other partners as well in other countries, how they have worked together and how they were formed. I think over the years, a lot of this history and context has gotten lost, or we've just been very poor at telling our own story, which is not an uncommon thing in conservation. We know that many of you attending today have never engaged with Partners in Flight or don't know what Partners in Flight is. And perhaps you don't know what the North American Bird Conservation Initiative is or what the Road to Recovery effort is. And so the history does not capture all bird conservation groups across North America, what I present today, but it provides just a glimpse of how Partners in Flight operates and was formed. And then my co-chair, Elaine, will talk a little bit about the groups within Partners in Flight. There's so much great work going on across the hemisphere, and we hope to really help elevate that work through this subcommittee. And so while we set our sights to the future with this exciting new group, we don't want to dwell too much on the past, but glancing back at our history may really help to lay a few extra bricks for that stronger foundation. So Elaine and I represent the Partners in Flight Science Committee, and if it's your first time at a meeting like this, we welcome you, and we're really glad that you're here. So I'm going to move over to my PowerPoint now. I assume everybody can still see my slides. So we'll go ahead and get started. So I think, some of this context has gotten lost. So while Partners in Flight did not begin until 1990, I want to help kind of set the stage here with what was happening in the 1960s through 1980s, around this time in the US when scientists and the public were noticing the decline of songbirds. So in 1962, Rachel Carson wrote the book Silent Spring, alerting the public in the US to a loss in biodiversity, namely in birds, but other taxa as well. In response, Chandler Robbins at the U.S. Geological Survey began the Breeding Bird Survey in 1966 to track and document changes in breeding bird populations nationwide and today internationally. Around this time, researchers and the hunting population were noticing that waterfowl populations began to decline as well. In response, the North American Waterfowl Management Plan was written in 1986 as a way to coordinate large-scale waterfowl management and conservation at the full annual cycle range across the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. Migratory bird joint ventures were also formed at this time, focused again on waterfowl. Oops, I went too fast. And the North American Waterfowl Management Plan was therefore the first annual cycle conservation plan at a scale this large, at least in the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. In 1989, once the Breeding Bird Survey had years of robust data under its belt, Robbins published this paper, drawing attention to declines in neotropical migrants in particular. The following year, John Terborg published a book entitled Where Have All the Birds Gone?, which brought additional focus to the fact that migratory birds spend over half the year away from their breeding grounds, oftentimes in different countries, which at the time was a novel concept and needed more attention brought to it, at least in the United States and Canada. With migratory bird declines at the forefront and the North American Waterfowl Management Plan created as a template, Partners in Flight was formed in 1990 to bring attention, funding, and research to the plight of North American land birds. And as Partners in Flight began to plan conservation and partnerships at broad scales, with the influence and model of the North American Waterfowl Management Plan and the joint ventures, they pushed for the joint ventures to go all bird, meaning to roll in other birds other than just waterfowl, and that occurred in 1999. At the same time, with support from Partners in Flight, the North American Bird Conservation Initiative, or NABC, was formed to support the JVs in this endeavor and create a forum of agencies and organizations to address bird conservation issues. Now, discussions in 2017 at a Partners in Flight science meeting, like the one we have here today, but this one was in person, led to the quantification of the net loss of avifauna in North America, with the 3 Billion Birds paper in the journal Science, authored by prominent ornithologists and Partners in Flight members, like Ken, who's here with us today, across the US, Canada, and Mexico. Post 3 Billion Birds paper, a handful of the authors, namely Ken Rosenberg, Tom Will, and Pete Mara, created the Road to Recovery, which is a movement to focus support for species working groups and rapidly declining tipping point species, and to push for increased focus on social science and co-production of science from the outset of projects to include many diverse partners. So now I will hand it over to my Canadian co-chair of Partners in Flight Science Committee, Ellen Camfield, to tell you a little bit more about the different groups within Partners in Flight. Don't know if Ellen is here.
Sarah, this is Edwin. I'm sorry to jump in.
Yes.
Can we speak a little slower for the translator so
Yes.
that it'll give her time to catch up?
Yes.
Thanks.
Thank you. No, that was good. It's funny because I was already trying to speak very slowly, but it's not slow enough. Okay, Ellen is having trouble getting into the meeting. So I'm going to cover this slide and I hope that she will be able to get on there. So we're going to pivot a little bit. Okay, so within Partners in Flight, we have a Partners in Flight steering committee, and the most important one, I'm just kidding, the Partners in Flight Science Committee, which we have here today. Then we have a Partners in Flight Western Working Group, which focuses on the Western US, Western Canada, and Western parts of Mexico. And they have their own MODIS group within that. Then there's a Partners in Flight Eastern Working Group, which is the Eastern US, Canada, and Eastern parts of Mexico as well. And the rest of North America are included in these groups if interested. Partners in Flight is also a voluntary group of groups. And so anyone is welcome to join these groups, and we will have contact information about how you engage with these groups here in just 1 minute. And then there is a Boreal Partners in Flight group as well. Now, within the Partners in Flight Science Committee, which we represent here today, we have a series of subcommittees. We have the Avian Conservation Assessment Database, which focuses on threat scores, trend scores, and many other data that are compiled by subject matter experts on these species across species ranges. And they fold in a lot of data from many different long-term data sources, including the Breeding Bird Survey, eBird, and many other survey efforts like that. This is a more technical group that talks through analyses and needs that regional expertise. So if you are interested in something like this, also reach out to us as well. There's the Population Estimates Database Subcommittee that maintains that database that makes estimates of populations of many different species across many of our North American countries in that group as well. We have we also have a few subcommittees that are project based, which means they were formed to focus on certain analyses or certain projects and products that Partners in Flight Science saw a need for. One of those is the full annual cycle analysis. It's a cluster analysis showing a lot of migratory connections, um, migratory connectivity, populations to populations that is forthcoming in a Partners in Flight Frontiers in Bird Science series we are publishing. And then migration connections shows connections between breeding populations by state, Canadian province, and bird conservation region to where those birds overwinter in the neotropics. And then today's kickoff of our brand new shiny PIF Science Subcommittee is that of Migration Ecology. So I see Elen on here now. I will have her say hi here in just 1 minute to introduce herself. But this is kind of the structure of Partners in Flight, and we're just trying to do better about communicating our structure and how to get involved in those groups. These are some slides I forgot to show you a minute ago that talk about the Avian Conservation Assessment Database, the Population Estimates Database. All of these are maintained by Partners in Flight Science Committee. And here is a link in case you would like to get involved. If you want us to add you to the Partners in Flight Science Committee listserv, just email one of us. You see our emails here on the screen. I'll give you a minute to screen capture that or write that down. The Partners in Flight Get Involved link also talks about the working groups and different subcommittees if you're interested in joining our effort. I will turn it over to Elen to say hi if you want to add anything, Elen, and then after that, we will hand it over to our 4 co-chairs if you'd like to do that, Elen.
Great, thank you. Sorry, I was having technical difficulties. Luckily, I'm working from home today, so I could pull out my personal laptop because I think our firewalls were blocking access. Anyway, I'm Elen Camfield, and I'm with the Canadian Wildlife Service, and I'm the Canadian co-chair for the Partners in Flight Science Committee. And happy to see a great turnout for today for the kickoff for our Migration Ecology subcommittee. And I will not take any more time. I'll turn it over to our new committee co-chairs.
Yes, please take it away, ladies. They have their own PowerPoint presentation where they will introduce themselves. So handing it over to our new Migration Ecology subcommittee co-chairs. I will stop sharing.
Great. Thanks, Sarah and Elen. I will just get our little slides up here. Hopefully you should be seeing that now. All right, so welcome everyone, and thanks so much for being here. It's great to see such a good turnout. And thank you, Sarah and Elen, for the helpful overview and history of Partners in Flight to put things in context for us. And on behalf of all of us co-chairs, we're really excited about this new subcommittee, and we're really looking forward to meeting everyone and seeing how it grows. We've got this short introduction here to the new subcommittee, and we'll start with a brief introduction from each of us for co-chairs. So take it away, Anna.
Hi, everyone, and thanks, Amy, for starting us off. My name is Anna Lello-Smith. I am the Avian Conservation Coordinator for the Wildlife Conservation Society Mesoamerica and Western Caribbean region. So I support bird conservation projects in the region and try to build partnerships to do full annual cycle conservation. And yeah, I'm very excited to be here with the other co-chairs to kick off the subcommittee.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Fabiola Rodriguez. I am originally from Honduras, but I'm currently living in the United States. I am a postdoc at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, where I am working on exploring ways to use eBird data to derive community metrics to inform on the status of bird communities in the neotropics.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Maya Wilson. I'm the Land Bird Monitoring Program Manager with Birds Caribbean. We're a nonprofit that works with partners across the Caribbean islands to conserve birds and their habitats. Over the last few years, we've been very focused on building several networks to monitor and conserve land birds. including the Caribbean MODIS collaboration to try to grow that network on the islands. And yeah, I'm excited to be here to be part of this subcommittee and learn a ton and connect with all of you.
Hi again, everyone. I'm Amy, and I'm joining you today from Vancouver, where I'm on the unceded and ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. I'm the British Columbia MODIS coordinator with Birds Canada and a shorebird ecologist. I'm originally from Nova Scotia and got into birds through semi-palmated sandpipers in the Bay of Fundy. And I've kind of been gradually making my way west with a fairly long stop to study red knots in James Bay in Northern Ontario before coming to British Columbia, where I now work on MODIS projects on shorebirds and passerines in southwestern and northeastern parts of the province. I also continue to do some analysis work on shorebird population demographics. I'm really glad to be part of this group, and I look forward to hopefully helping facilitate and build collaborations working on various aspects of migratory ecology to benefit birds.
All right, thanks, Amy. So yeah, as Sarah mentioned in her intro, this is a brand new subcommittee, so we're still developing the vision and the scope, and we definitely welcome ideas from longstanding members of PIF and new folks, anyone who has experience or ideas and inspiration. We're very open to kind of shaping this as we go. But we're thinking about this subcommittee as a forum to really bring people together around using tracking technologies and methods to try to fill knowledge gaps and inform conservation strategies for migratory birds across the hemisphere. And so we really want to provide an interactive space where people can learn about tracking technologies and how the different technologies can be used individually or integrated to answer conservation questions, and then also to share experiences using these technologies to brainstorm ideas and hopefully to develop collaborative projects. And our goal is to represent a diversity of geographies, people of all different ages from all different areas, bird taxa. So yeah, we're really excited to create this space to bring people together and learn together. And again, we really welcome your ideas and feedback.
We just wanted to share what we have planned for the moment in terms of meeting schedule. This subcommittee will meet every fourth Thursday of every other month. So for the 2024-2025 period, we hope to fill 7 meetings. And the time is going to be different than today. Today was a special day just for the launch, but we will meet from 1 to 2:30 p.m. Central Time. We are going to be sharing with you all a link to a Google form so that we can compile contact information to know who wants to continue being part of the subcommittee. And that way we will be in touch with everyone on future meetings and other activities and events.
Yeah, so here are just a few ideas that we jotted down as far as future topics and resources. Nothing here is set in stone, so once again, we welcome input. We know that many people are interested in MODIS and want to hear a lot about that tracking technology. We also want to cover other tracking methods like geolocators, satellite tags. We also recognize that there's a need to talk about integrating multiple methods. So that's one of the other topics that we're thinking about. The last couple bullets are actually tied to the Google form that Fabi mentioned. There are a couple questions in that form related to this because we want to facilitate the development of collaborative projects and start to build a database of funding opportunities. So again, if you can just fill out the contact form, we can start that process and start to connect people not only for the the future meetings, but also to start to develop these tools and databases. So this is the QR code to take you to that Google form in case anybody would prefer to use that QR code. I'm also going to paste the link into the chat. So so please, when you get a chance, if you want to continue to stay connected with the subcommittee, this is one of the mechanisms that we're going to use to start to put that group together.
All right, great. So here's kind of the outline and the details of today's agenda. We've already checked off the first two items, which was hearing from Sarah and Ellen about PIF and our little intro. But we've got coming up too. So first, we're going to have Valentina Gomez Bahamon speaking about using tracking technologies to address conservation challenges, and then we'll hear from Nick Bailey about applications of these tracking technologies and experiences from the neotropics. We'll have lots of time for questions and discussion as well, most certainly about the presentations, but as several of us have mentioned, we'd also love to hear about your ideas for this group, topics you're most interested in, resources that you feel are needed to make projects and international collaborations happen, other gaps that this group might be able to help fill, or any other ideas that you have. So thanks so much again, everyone, for being here. And now I believe Fabio will introduce us to our next speaker.
That's correct. Thank you, everyone. I am very happy to welcome Dr. Valentina Gomez Bahamon, who's an assistant professor in the Department of Biological Sciences at Virginia Tech. She studies how evolutionary processes interact with the ecological context, predisposing species to go extinct or thrive under current and future environmental challenges. She is originally from Colombia, where she is a volunteer member of SELVA, Research for Conservation in the Neotropics. She accomplished her PhD at the University of Illinois, Chicago, and the Field Museum of Natural History, followed by a postdoctoral fellowship at Penn State University and a visiting postdoctoral position at the University of Michigan. Welcome again, Dr. Gomez Bahamon. The space is yours.
Thank you, Fabiola. And thanks everyone for being here. I'm gonna share my screen. Okay. Is that good? Okay, so I'm here representing a group of people. So this is, a truly collaborative work. We got together to think about a review on different tracking technologies and focusing especially on how different conservation challenges can be addressed by tracking technologies, with a special focus on smaller birds. So technology is very exciting. There's many things that we can do with technology to understand how organisms move, how they interact among each other, and where they go, basically. And it is very exciting, but it's also challenging because there are costs involved. There is also, different spatial resolution that you can get with different technologies and different information. Sometimes you have to recapture the bird, or sometimes you need very expensive tools to get the information. So based on this, we thought there is no perfect tracking method. How can we get together information to understand, or to aid people when they are thinking about their own projects, which is the best technology to use? So we were basing this review on starting with the question, and then from the question start thinking about how can we address conservation issues with different tracking technologies. So some of the considerations are, how will the tagging inform future conservation actions? And then things like, how do I share the results? because as more birds are tagged and more information is accumulated, then more possibility to understand comparatively how avifauna is moving and changing through time. Which species is important to keep in mind? Things like their traits, how big they are, how social they are, and also the sample size. How much tags do I have to deploy in order to get the information that we need for the particular issue that we're trying to address? Questions like, are we interested in local movements, how the birds are interacting among each other in the breeding season, or if there is, long distance tracking involved with connectivity, survival, starting to think about including fitness into these conservation questions. And how many receivers do you need to have in place to be able to get enough information? And then basic things like the weight of the bird, the pulse rate that you want information from each of the from your technology, and how long do you want that technology to last. So our intent was not to review the different tracking technologies. That has been done in the past, and there's a lot of information about the technologies. But we do have to think about the advantages and disadvantages of each one of them. So things like, for example, if you need to retrieve the tag, like, for example, with archival light level geolocators and barometric pressure geolocators, or if you get the information from towers like MODOS or from GPS. And then things like the spatial resolution, right? Because if your question is about long distance travel, then you need longer distance resolution than if the question is about what are the particular habitat parts that the bird is using, you would probably need a smaller resolution. And then how long the life of the information is from the tag that you're deploying. There's also interesting new technological advances, like, for example, information about altitude with the barometric pressure geolocators that it's worth incorporating into some of these newer conservation challenges. And so we got together to think about, read a lot of the literature and start identifying some of the I guess, larger groups of conservation questions. And so we identified 5 different of them, which were migratory seasonal movements, stationary season movements within like breeding and wintering and stopover locations, migratory phenology with relation of like timing of migration, demographic characteristics, how, survival changes in different localities or, among different birds. And then migratory connectivity, how the breeding and the wintering grounds are connected between different populations. And so with that, we basically went through the literature and we started to see which one of the different tagging technologies were more used or more appropriate for each one of the questions. And you can see here in the stars, with the stars, that there are, there's not one perfect for any of them. And you can use multiple of these tagging technologies for different questions, but there are some who can get information about which would be the ideal technology for the types of questions that they're asking. So if you're asking questions about demography, you might choose something like automated telemetry. Whereas if you're asking questions about longer distance movement, you might think about different technologies. So we didn't intend to go over every single research that has been done using these technologies because there's a lot, and it's very exciting to see that people have tagged birds all over the world. We didn't focus on the world either. We focused in the American continent and smaller birds and some of the research that had been done, which we found fitted very well with these categories of conservation issues that we wanted to address. So, for example, we found with the migratory seasonal movements that there's information about stopover locations and in particularly how stopovers can influence survival. This study by Ward et al. Found that fat load and the day of the year and the wind movement can affect survival. Similarly, and that was in swinson thrushes, and then in great cheek thrushes, Gomez et al. Found that the pace of migration was also affected by the fat accumulation. So the stopover sites influence not only the survival, but also the pace. Barn and cliff swallows have established breeding populations in South America very recently. I think barn swallows 44 years ago, and then the cliff swallow in 2018. And they're doing really well there. And these researchers tagged the birds with geolocators, and they found that the wintering grounds have changed, and also the direction and distance of migration. And then there's also a really interesting study by Poirier et al. In 2024, which looked to see how information about the use of the landscape can be incorporated into urban planning, because most of the forested places in cities don't have understory coverage of plants, and they found that undercover plants and edges of the forest is what helps swine thrushes for molting. So it's very interesting because they do a more detailed study on the actual habitat that they're using in urban places. Then there's information about connectivity, whether breeding populations of different birds that are declining are also going to different places in the winter. And then there's also identification of fine-scale important habitat like roost sites in purple martins. So purple martins were found to not have very strong connectivity. Different breeding populations of purple martins winter in islands in the rivers in the Amazon. And it's in the same tree, you could have birds from one population and another roosting together. With respect to stationary seasonal movements, there's information about, for example, Kirtland warblers that after breeding, so when there's fledglings, they move within the breeding areas and further. So they not only depend on those nesting sites, but they also depend on areas around. And especially also the birds that don't breed, they move a lot within the breeding range. And then white-crested elainias also moved a lot, but in the wintering ranges. So in the Amazon, they had different, widespread movements while they were wintering. There's studies with respect to the timing of migration, so phenology of migration, on how pesticides in white-crowned sparrows influenced their departure date. So they kind of got this pesticide apparently makes them droopy or sleepy. I don't know how to say that, but basically they migrated later when they were exposed to the pesticides. There's also studies on the effect of climate change on migratory timing, comparing birds in North American migration and then South American migration. And then the effects of habitat quality, again, on the timing and pace of migration, like the great cheek thrush research that I already talked about, and then also in American redstarts. And then some examples of the demographic characteristics. There's now studies that can estimate survival, which is very cool because we can compare survival from different populations, for example, different species that are under different conservation concerns. And then reproductive behavior, because light level geolocators can tell us information about, that they have a different signal when birds are nesting than when they're not nesting. So people are doing very creative work to use this technology and understand these different parts of their biology. And there has also been other studies, like for other reviews, like for example, this one on conservation of North American migratory birds. that also talk about how we can include species-specific traits into the conservation questions, and then also talking about larger birds. And we also found that there's some resources that people can researchers can use to get the public engaged. People really love seeing migratory movements on a screen. We all do. It's just seeing how a bird moved from the breeding grounds such long distances and knowing where they stopped is very exciting. And if we can show this and we can talk about the research that we do with the public, we think that that is a very powerful way to get people engaged. And so to conclude, we identify conservation questions and applications, and we think that this is a good way to go when thinking about which technology you want to use for your particular research. Then we suggest identifying and collaborating with partners across multiple geographies. And we think that that migration tracking offers a unique opportunity to engage the public and tell exciting migration stories. And so with that, I want to thank everyone who's here and also the co-authors of this manuscript that we're getting together. And then I'm happy to answer questions in English o en español. Cualquier cosa que no quedara clara, también estoy muy feliz de responder. Thank you.
Thank
Go
you
for
so
it,
much,
Amy.
Valentina, for that wonderful talk. Yeah, if anyone has questions, we have a few minutes now for questions for Valentina about this presentation before we move on to our next speaker. So go ahead and put them in the chat if you'd prefer, or you can also say them here as well. I have a question actually that I was wondering what your thoughts were or what you found in the studies that you were reviewing about using tracking technologies to study survival, and whether there were ways to maybe get around confounding mortality with tag loss.
Wow, that's a very interesting question. I can think about things, but I don't know if that would be the right answer about what other people have suggested. If you ask me, from my perspective, numbers can help. If you have statistical power, then that's helpful to actually, But I do think that can be an issue. I don't know if anyone here has information about how often tags are lost. I would like to know that. Yeah. We're getting some questions also in there.
Yeah, I can read out some of the questions for you, Valentina. So someone asked, are the slides going to be shared? This is also a question I had. There was so much amazing information in that talk, and a lot of great references. So I know you all are working on a paper. Is there an estimate of when that might be out, or is there a place that this information can be accessed before that?
I'm not sure if the presentation is going to be shared. I think the organizers can help with that question.
Yeah, I think that's an option. We're still in prep with the manuscript, and I think once we submit, we can share those slides with folks. if you're interested. Also, I'll put my email in the chat, and if you're interested in seeing those slides, just shoot me an email and I can share those when we can.
Awesome. Thanks, Sarah. Ana Diaz said, sort of in response to Amy's question, it's usually an estimation of apparent survival. I don't know, Ana, if you feel like expanding on that. No pressure.
Well, yeah, basically what those studies do is based on apparent survival. It's not going to be real survival, and because there is always that caveat of different reasons why tags stop being detected. So it's a good estimation, but it's clear that it's just apparent survival. Yeah.
I guess you could also think about the tag, right? Because that's one of the things that we have in our review. If you have a tag that gives you enough resolution that you can go back to where you find the tag is not moving or something like that, then you can see if it's still on the bird or not. But I guess the bird doesn't stay there forever, right? Something can eat it or whatever. Or, I don't know. If it's not moving, then it's an indication of something. And then if you have enough spatial resolution, you could potentially recover in one of the stages of the life of the bird. You know, if it's in the breeding region, then you can go back and see how many of them survived or not. Or I think we have a question in Spanish.
Yeah. So Isabel says, my question is, what is the biggest challenge with getting data from the MODIS network? It's kind of a big question. But yeah, go for it, Valentina.
I'm going to respond in Spanish because the question is in Spanish. Sí, yo pienso que de las cosas que es más difícil es tener suficientes torres que detecten el paso de los individuos. Si tienes una sola torre, es menos probable que vayas a tener una señal que si hay muchas torres, como por ejemplo en Norteamérica. En Sudamérica hay algunas. Creo que Nick puede ayudar un poquito con esta pregunta, pero pienso que ese sigue siendo el challenge. Es básicamente cuántas torres hay disponibles para recibir una señal.
Can I ask a quick follow-up question to that before going on? Do you know if there is, or if anyone is working on sort of like a map of where to prioritize new MODIS towers, like especially on the non-breeding grounds? Nick is nodding. Yeah, I'm curious if people are thinking about that, like, you know, if we have limited resources to put up new towers, where should we prioritize?
Nick, go ahead.
A number of different strategic planning exercises as to where the biggest gaps are in the network, and that's across the entire Americas. There is a map that I've seen. I don't know whether it's publicly available. That's kind of like the dream MODIS network, that if you could have the perfect network, this is what it would look like. I know I've seen it in some presentations from, I think, Stu McKenzie, among others. But yeah, there people have been thinking about that and trying to work out, you know, where we're going to get the biggest return for investments in a given station.
That's awesome.
I think a lot of that prioritization also happens at the regional level too. There's regional points of contact across the US and Canada and Central America and Latin America. And so those are available online. I'll put that in the chat.
Yes, there are a number of different regional planning maps for different regional coordination groups for MODIS. There's also some larger strategic planning initiatives, like Nick said. I'm more familiar with speaking to planning in Canada, but we have a new initiative that's through some funding from the Canadian Foundation for Innovation that is funding a major infrastructure expansion for MODIS. Unfortunately, that funding is limited to Canada, so the expansion of more towers will largely happen in Canada for that particular initiative, but will hopefully benefit the whole network. And so we're currently doing some major strategic planning to try and fill gaps where they're most needed across the country at the moment. hopefully we should see some new stations coming up from that project within the next couple of years.
Very cool. All right, I'll go back to the questions in the chat, and then Francisco, we can get to yours in a minute. So there's a question about archival versus non-archival tags. Do we have any new research highlighting the pros or cons of each? For instance, are MODIS tags becoming increasingly used? Should we be using archival tags despite low recovery rates?
Yeah, I think from our perspective in this manuscript that I talked about, is basically depends on the question. So, for example, there's information like the altitude information from barometric tags that you cannot get from MODIS. So it depends on what you're asking, and there's some studies showing that crossing ecological barriers, for example, birds can change their type of migration, and they can fly at higher altitudes or lower altitudes, and that has implications on their survival. So you might be interested in asking that question. For that, you still need to have that type of tag. So basically, it depends, I think.
Great, thank you. And I'll ask one more from the chat, and then we can get to Francisco. Okay, Jen says, Hola Valentina, thank you for such a nice presentation. Just wondering, with the increasing amount of data in tracking birds, what are the big questions that could be explored in the next decade that we have not explored in the past, and what are the new challenges?
I think that's a really great question, and I would love to hear from people in this group, from everyone who's here, what questions they think are the next to explore. I know which one I would like to explore, but it's not necessarily what everyone would think. There is a movement to think about more of communities rather than necessarily independent species. And I think that one of the most exciting movements would be to understand how communities of birds are moving and using, habitats like the wintering grounds. And if we can use tagging to understand how those different species are interacting within the communities, that would be really fun to read about. And I think can give us more information about, places that are important for many different species. But I'm pretty sure there's other really exciting questions people are thinking about asking in the next decade.
Yeah, that's a great one. And maybe if others are thinking of questions, feel free to put them in the chat. That's definitely the purpose of this group, is to sort of be thinking together about these questions. Okay, Francisco.
Hola, ¿me escuchan? Muy bien. Pues muchas felicidades por este nuevo grupo. Estamos muy contentos desde la parte latina por la creación de este grupo y pues por ver cómo podemos colaborar. Y tengo una pregunta. Con todo lo que investigaste, ¿sabes si hay como alguna relación entre los datos, los mejores datos con algún tipo de tag, por ejemplo, radiotransmisor, o si son localizadores satelitales, y si son para especies como focales?
Claro, depende mucho de qué datos quieres, ¿no? Entonces, si quieres resolución espacial, entonces quizás sea mejor utilizar tags que sean más como tipo radiotelemetry. Si quieres, digamos que movimientos a muy largas distancias, tal vez eso sea mejor los geolocalizadores, sobre todo en especies pequeñas en las que no se les puede poner un GPS que las siga a largas distancias. Entonces, la idea es esa, ¿no? Como decir digamos que las diferentes tecnologías dependen de qué es la información que queremos tener. Y todas, digamos que son útiles, incluso, ¿no? Incluso el bird banding es súper útil, pero pues van a tener sus limitaciones.
Gracias, Valentín.
Gracias por tu pregunta.
Okay, going back to the chat, Bianca, hola Bianca, dice, estoy escribiendo una propuesta para solicitar fondos para estaciones motos en Guatemala, en la costa del Pacífico. Me saber si país esta prioridad como para tener más respaldo en la propuesta. Y dice también queremos trabajar con aves playeras y uso de hábitat en salineres y planos lodosos.
Well, no. Sorry, I don't know if to say this in English or in Spanish because I should move this question to someone who knows about what are the MOTUS priorities. Um, Bianca, voy a pasar la pregunta a alguien que te pueda dar información sobre cómo se están, digamos que priorizando las estaciones de MOTUS. No sé.
Yo puedo contestarlo si quieres, ¿vale? Em, Pues la respuesta es sí, Bianca, que realmente toda esa zona del norte de Centroamérica es muy prioritaria ahora porque es donde es el mayor hueco en términos de estaciones a lo largo de Centroamérica. México ya hay cada vez más, Costa Rica hay muchas, pero tenemos como un hueco entre Nicaragua, Honduras y Guatemala. Belice sí está llenando, pero sobre todo la costa Pacífico donde estás planteando montar esas estaciones, sí es un hueco muy evidente en la red actualmente. Y de la única estación que tenemos actualmente sobre el Pacífico de Guatemala ha sido excelente, ha producido muchas detecciones. Entonces, claro que es una zona que vale la pena invertir y tener más estaciones.
Yeah, I definitely agree that the Pacific Coast all along Central America is definitely an important place for additional MODIS coverage. And beyond that, I think MODIS has been demonstrated to work quite well with shorebirds in a lot of studies. So I think, yeah, shorebird work on the Pacific Coast in Guatemala with MODIS would absolutely be extremely valuable.
Yeah, and Bianca, I would love to talk about this as well. As you know, because we've been collaborating, WCS has some work with shorebirds on the Pacific coast of Guatemala, so that could be a cool project to work on together. Edwin?
Sí, buenas tardes. Hola, Bianca y todos los demás. También quería agregar un poquito sobre esta pregunta. Muchos de los estados en el oeste de Estados Unidos están muy interesados en apoyar y colaborar en proyectos de MOTUS en esta región de la parte norte de Centroamérica y las partes suroeste de México, porque como dice Nick, ahí hay un vacío grande de estaciones de MOTUS. Así que estamos por medio de los estados del Pacific Flyway y de Southern Wings. Estamos buscando comenzar un proyecto para cultivar y promover proyectos de motus, especialmente en El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras y la parte suroeste de México. Así es que cualquier socio que trabaje en esa región, si le gustaría ponerse en contacto conmigo, con gusto le doy seguimiento. Gracias.
Thanks, Edwin. Okay, we have about 5 more minutes for questions if anyone has any others. If not, I think we can move into the next presentation. Thank you so much, Valentina, for that presentation and for answering all of those great questions. Yeah, and I'll hand it back to Amy.
Great. Yes. Thanks again, Valentina. That was wonderful. And now we have our next speaker, and it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Nick Bailey, who is the Director of Migratory Ecology with Selva. Nick is a lifelong birder and migration enthusiast and began studying migration ecology in earnest during his PhD in the year 2000. Since, he has studied migration in both the Palearctic and Nearctic neotropical systems, resulting in more than 50 publications. Since 2009, He has been leading SELVA's award-winning Migratory Ecology program, which focuses on understanding the needs of migratory land birds on stopover and during the non-breeding season in Colombia and Central America. Recently, he has been focusing much of his energy on converting research findings into on-the-ground conservation action. Nick will be speaking today about exploring the role of neotropical stopover and non-breeding sites in sustaining the migrations of Nearctic neotropical land birds. Thank you so much, Nick, for being here, and we are really looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Amy. Is my audio coming through okay?
Yeah,
Right.
it is.
It's not too bad. Yeah. So I've had a rough couple of days, just to let everyone know that this presentation isn't exactly what I intended to show today, but it's pretty close. So hopefully it will inspire people to think about some of these questions related to migratory ecology. And specifically, I'm going to focus a lot on stopover ecology and behavior during this talk. And I'll be touching on one of those questions or one of the themes that was brought up at the beginning of this session, which is really about integrating different methodologies. So what I really hope I can show today is how we can use methodologies that go from kind of the large scale, the broad scale, continental scale, and then work our way down to individual birds and how individual birds are actually behaving on stopovers. And I will argue right from the start that, when we think about birds having a successful migration, energy is absolutely key. And without energy, there simply isn't migration. So when we start to thinking about, conserving migratory land birds, I think we really need to understand where the energy for migration comes from. And that leads us to a whole bunch of questions that we need to address to really understand how birds are fueling these remarkable migrations that fascinate all of us here. And we also need to start to change the way we think about how birds use stopover sites. For decades, there was really kind of this perception in many ways that birds use multiple sites along the length of their migratory journey, and they're kind of just accumulating energy, each of them, and they use that energy just to make relatively short flights and keep going. But I think what's emerged in the last 10 years through tracking technologies, through more on the ground studies, tracking birds leaving stopover sites, is that actually completely the opposite is true. And that in many species, what we're seeing is that they use a very small number of very distinct and strategically located stopover sites to gain the energy they need to fuel the vast majority of their migration. So we've got this kind of, depiction here on the right of what one of these strategies could look like. This is based on geolocated data from Veeries, and which, suggests that birds really are using just 3 or 4 stopover sites, or in many species, to actually gain the energy to complete their entire migration. And yes, they are stopping in other areas along the way, but those stopovers have different functions. And it's another great question for this group is thinking about these different functions that stopover sites have. And there's been a recent review on that that provides some real food for thought as to, what we need to learn about stopovers to understand their role in the migration of a given individual or species. So how can we go about identifying, but also prioritizing stopover sites for conservation? Because when we think about the Partners in Flight group, it's very much orientated towards conservation. It's not just about understanding how birds migrate, but also how can we help sustain those migrations in the future. So we can begin with these very broad scale data sets. We can use data, particularly across North America from radar, and there's some absolutely incredible work coming out of radar now where we can start to estimate the number of birds approximately that are dropping into a given area and then leaving it in successive days. But we don't have to limit ourselves to thinking that this is only a tool that's appropriate in North America as well. There are NEXRAD radars scattered across Central and South America. And there are now several individuals starting to work with these in Mexico, also in Colombia. Jacob Drucker and others have been leading a push to analyze data from radars in Colombia. So we can use these to start to understand these very broad scale patterns of where birds are migrating, but also, where there is evidence that they're actually making stops. We can also glean an awful lot from eBird. And I think it's a highly underused resource so far. When you start to examine the eBird status and trends models, you run them on a week-by-week basis, you start to see very clear patterns that are indicative of areas where, at a population level, you have species stopping over. But we can also go about this, not using these existing data sets, but actually create new data sets. And that's one of the examples I want to delve in today. And this is using standardized occupancy surveys across the migration season to get information about the probability of birds stopping over in any given region. And obviously, tracking data from all these different tracking technologies that Valentina mentioned in her talk can also start to give us an idea of where birds are stopping over. Obviously, there's often problems with precision with these data, especially because migration often overlaps with the equinoxes. But it certainly gives us an idea of where we can start looking for, where these stopovers might be. And just focus on some of these points for cerulean warblers, the amazing data set of geolocators that Doug Raybuck and collaborators pulled together. Some of those points in Central America will be coming back to them a little bit later on. But I will argue that, while this broad scale data is very useful to start to identify potential regions for stopovers, it is absolutely essential that we have local and individual level data to determine things like what contribution does a given stopover make to the energy needs of a bird? Or which habitats are they using? Is one habitat providing more resources than another? Can a bird fuel up quicker in one stopover habitat relative to another? And what is the role of a given stopover in the migratory strategy of a bird? What percentage of the migration is a given stopover actually fueling, which starts to get at that question that I mentioned of prioritizing these sites. If you've got a site that's providing 50% of the fuel for a bird's entire migration and others that are providing 10%, it's potentially something we can use to start to generate a prioritization of where we should invest precious conservation resources. So I just want to begin with that little kind of idea I mentioned about, there's a lot of hidden data in eBird and in the models that are coming out of eBird status and trends. And this one I just find absolutely remarkable. So this is bay-breasted warbler. We're at the last week of October, and there is a phenomenal concentration of bay-breasted warblers kind of in the eastern part of the Midwest and the southern Appalachians. Very clearly must be a stopover of some sort, because obviously there's a species that's breeding way up in the boreal forest. And from there is basically nothing until this kind of concentration that appears on what I like to call a landing platform along the Caribbean coast of Costa Rica and Panama. And so there's a very clear suggestion from this eBird data that birds are stopping over in this region in the US and then making what appears to be a direct 3,000-kilometer flight down into southern Central America. And it actually is very, very similar to what blackpoll warblers do, but over the Atlantic Ocean. But yet nobody's ever talked about bay-breasted warbler migration, making these, giant leaps. Everybody focus on blackpoll. So there's some really low-hanging fruits that need to be investigated. And this is where I really feel, you need this on-the-ground data to start to understand how birds are using these given regions. The example I wanted to really delve into today in terms of using these broad-scale data sets is showing how we can use these we can use an occupancy survey framework to generate information about how birds are using given regions on migration. And so this comes from a project called the Neotropical Flyways Project, which has the objective of trying to identify critical stopover regions throughout the near tropics, or the main near tropical flyway running from Colombia up through Central America. And so what this project has done is gone out and carried out surveys across the region, which is stratified by precipitation, as you can see on this map, but also by elevation. So we can start to get a sense of what environmental conditions birds are actually keying in on it. And for some of you, it may be a surprise the considerable variation that there is in precipitation across this region, from deserts in the Guajira Peninsula to the east, to these incredibly wet rainforests in other areas. So there's a very complex landscape that birds are actually migrating over and making choices as to where they're going to stop over. And the same applies with elevation. We have peaks all the way up to 5,000 meters, 15,000 feet, but also lowlands. So there's this huge variation in elevation and associated ecosystems that birds might be choosing. So in this project, what we did is carry out repeat surveys of individual transects at each one of these points that you're seeing. At each point, we've set up 8 to 16 transects, and then we repeated them 4 times every 9 days, and did that during 6 periods over the length of the entire migration period. And we analyze this information in an occupancy framework. And one of the very simple measures you can take out of this is take one of those individual sites where you have a series of transects and just estimate the raw occupancy probability at a given site. And this works particularly well for species that are relatively rarely detected, like cerulean warblers, as you can see here. And it starts to give you a sense of the areas where we're getting, fairly high detection rates. And you can see, particularly in the case of cerulean warblers, is something we'll come back to, there on the Caribbean slope of Costa Rica. We can see that there's particularly high occupancy rates at certain sites. But we can actually take this data one step further. So we can run occupancy models where we enter environmental variables, we enter elevation, latitude, and other variables that we think are going to influence where birds are stopping over, and come up with a model that best explains the variation, and then make a spatial prediction from that information. And that's what you're seeing here for Canada warblers on their fall migration as they're migrating south through Costa Rica, Panama, and into northern Colombia. And there's an incredibly clear signature from these just basic observation data that these birds are concentrating at mid-elevation in mountainous areas of these regions. So immediately super useful information that we didn't have before, and just coming from relatively simple observational data. But obviously we can take this one step further. So if we have multiple predictive layers for a whole set of species, we can then actually overlap them and start to understand where critical areas are at a community level, not just at an individual or an individual species level. So here we have 20 species stopping over in northern Colombia on their spring migration. And we put those all together and we come up with a map like this, where we start to see that there are some regions that are far more important at the community level than others. And so it really starts to give us a sense of, where we can prioritize areas for conservation action. And just hold this image in your head a little bit longer, because we'll see some of these areas coming up as we move forward in this talk, and showing how birds are actually using them to fuel their migrations. So, there are these very clear patterns that we get from radar, that we get from eBird data, we get from doing surveys, but do they really relate to local stopover behavior? If there's a clear signal of stopover, if we go and catch birds on the ground, do we find they're actually stopping over for a prolonged period, gaining weight? And that's, it's really a key piece that's often missing from studies of migratory ecology and stopover behavior. So there's a number of ways of going about this, but really there is, the bottom line is that we need to catch these birds to start to understand what is happening in a given stopover region or at a given stopover site. And there's very simple metrics we can look at to start to get a sense of how birds are using a given area. So we just had that map of Colombia with these priority areas. Here we have 2 study sites where we've been running constant effort mist netting stations over several years that are in these priority areas. And one of the things we can look at, which is very simple with captures, is just how is body mass structured in the population. If you don't have birds gaining weight at a stopover, you should have a relatively tight kind of distribution of body mass and not a right-hand skew with some birds reaching much higher body masses that are indicative of birds fueling. So what you can actually do is just look at this distribution of body mass in any given species, and then look at the top 10% of birds and see, do these birds actually have a signature that they've been fueling? Just how much extra body mass do they have above lean body mass, let's say? And if you can work that out, there are actually these incredible formulas out there developed by a guy called Pennyquick, who worked for years and years on understanding the energetics of flight, and you can plug in basic data on how much fuel you think a bird is and estimate flight range. And that's what we did in this study with an undergrad student in Colombia, Natalia Cano. She did this for a bunch of species across northern Colombia and looked at the potential flight range of this top 10% of birds from these key stopover regions. And what she found is that as a community, most birds were capable of flights to somewhere in probably into northern Central America, maybe to Cuba, and perhaps just about making it to the tip of the Florida Peninsula. But there were a couple of species that were actually fueling up much more and were able to make much longer flights, potentially straight up to North America and beyond. But what there was clear evidence just from this very simple look at capture data is there was evidence for birds fueling up at these sites and then being able to make extended flights afterwards. But obviously, there's no substitute when you're looking at fuel gains as for actually being able to show them in an unequivocal way. And to do that, we not only need to catch birds, we need to recatch them. So recaptures are absolutely fundamental when we're to study stopover behavior. And we really need to work hard to generate those recaptures because every recapture is gold dust. We've been very fortunate to work in some areas where it's been relatively easy to recatch species. So here we've got an example of the gray-cheeked thrush. On the left, you're seeing the prediction for spring migration for where this species is stopping over. They appear to make an absolutely remarkable, phenomenal concentration just in the Santa Marta Mountains or the Sierra Nevada Santa Marta in northern Colombia. They don't seem to be anywhere else. And when you get on the ground there and start catching birds and recatching them, what you see is these fantastic body mass gains is what you're seeing on the graph on the right. So this is simply the time between the first capture and successive captures and the change in body mass of individual birds captured on more than one occasion. And so you can see, and this is expressed as a percentage of their lean body mass. So how much are they going up beyond what would be their basic body mass, right? So we're getting birds that are increasing after a 12-day stopover. They're increasing their body mass by around 50%. So very clear evidence that these areas that we've identified as potential stopovers, birds are actually making stopovers in these areas based on, data showing that they're increasing their body mass, and we're seeing visible increases in fat stores as well. And, this story has played out again and again in these different areas where we're starting to find, these high occupancy rates from the surveys and then coupling them with the recapture data. And we get this very clear picture that, where we have high occupancy rates, we tend to have prolonged stopovers. Here we have a whole bunch of species, a lot of them staying for longer than 10 days during the stopovers and making very clear mass gains during those stopovers. And the other thing we can do when we have these data is actually look at whether, and I mentioned this earlier, whether one habitat is providing more resources, better fueling conditions than another. And by setting up banding stations in different habitats, we can start to get a sense of which habitats provide more resources to these hungry migrants. And so this is another example. This is black-poll warblers arriving after that transatlantic flight during fall migration and landing on the Guajira Peninsula in northern Colombia. And again, very clear evidence from the occupancy surveys showing that this is where the concentration is. And when we got on the ground, we caught thousands of birds. And here we are working in what to most people would appear to be two very similar habitats. Tropical dry forest, relatively high canopy, 15 meters, 20 meters high. And it's surrounded by kind of a matrix where you have this dry, thorny scrub that's normally, only 2 or 3 meters high. So, similar but quite distinct habitats. And when we started to capture and recapture blackpoll warblers in these two habitats, in the first year we were working, we found a very relatively clear signature that birds in these taller forest, more forest-like areas were gaining weight quicker than the birds in the scrub, which for many people you think, yeah, that kind of makes sense. Probably, forest is better than scrub, right? Well, it's not as clear a picture as that, because when we went back in 2018, we caught so few birds in the forest that we couldn't even model the change in body mass, but we caught enough in the scrub to show that in 2018, the fuel deposition rate in that scrub was twice as high as it was in the scrub in the previous year, and was even higher than it was in the forest in the first year. So, when we're getting this data on the ground, we're not only understanding that there is variation between these stopover habitats, but the habitat quality is not a constant. It's going to depend on things like precipitation. It's going to depend on when the rains come. So there's a lot more layers that we need to peel off to really understand what do we need to conserve for these birds. It's not just this area. There are specific habitats, and there might be a matrix of habitats that we need to be thinking about. But not all birds are as easy to catch and recapture as gray-cheeked thrushes and blackpoll warblers in the two examples I've just shown you. There are species like cerulean warbler that we have now captured about 60 individuals on stopover on the Caribbean coast of Costa Rica, that area that I signaled earlier. But have we recaptured any? Well, 3 birds. That's not enough to be able to model it. But there's another way of getting really useful information as to how birds are using the area. Because often, it's simply a question of, are these just one-day roost stop and birds carry on? Or are they actually making multi-day stopovers on which we can assume they're gaining body mass? And to get at that, we can use tracking technology. So this is one of the really nice ways we can integrate tracking technologies into these questions. So we did this for cerulean warblers. We coupled it with a motor station on site. We got information like this from individual birds, where you can see that this individual was present for 6 days and then it just completely disappears, which we assume is it initiated its migratory flight. And when we put this together for 12 individuals that we tagged with MOTIS tags, we start to get a better picture of how cerulean warblers were using that stopover site. So on average, we found that birds were staying for 6.8 days. And the variation was between 3 days and up to 15 days. For some individuals, this area on the Caribbean coast of Costa Rica was clearly very important during their fall migration, both to recover from flights potentially directly from North America and then flying further on down into their Andean wintering grounds. But the genius of tracking technology for me is that when we discover these stopover sites, and we clearly find patterns of birds gaining mass, like we see in the gray-cheeked thrush in northern Colombia in spring, we can track the birds on leaving the stopover site and understand really what did that stopover site mean for that bird? How far did it fly afterwards? How much of its migratory route did it cover after stopping over at that site? And this is now, almost a textbook example with the gray-cheeked thrushes, where we predicted based on mass gains that birds were likely to be able to fly around 2,500 kilometers without having to stop. But how are we going to show this? And this is when MOTIS was just coming online. There were just, we can see from this map, there were towers and stations up, but still not many. But we got lucky and we got a bunch of detections that the time between leaving Colombia, based on the station we had in Colombia, and being detected either on the Gulf Coast of the US or higher up into the Midwest or even the Great Lakes region, there wasn't enough time for a bird to have stopped. They must have been flying pretty much nonstop, or if they did stop, it might have been for an hour. And so we were actually able to demonstrate that, birds leaving from this area not only have the fuel to fly do these long haul flights, well over 2,000 kilometers, but they actually did. And these birds were covering well over 50% of their spring migration distance based on the fuel gained at this one critical stopover site in northern Colombia. But we can do the same thing. It doesn't have to just be stopover sites. We can do the same thing with breeding sites and also non-breeding sites. These areas, they're used by birds for 4 or 5 months a year. These birds know them very well, and clearly they can have an important impact on migration as well. So again, coming back to black-billed warblers, we captured birds immediately prior to their spring migration. We estimated their potential departure mass and therefore energy stores. We estimated flight ranges, and then we followed them again with MOTIS, with using MOTIS tags through the MOTIS network. And what we found is that birds are actually accumulating enough energy at non-breeding sites, stationary non-breeding sites, which they're utilizing for 5 or 6 months to cover 50% of their migration towards their breeding ground. So in the case of black-billed warblers, it's almost the reverse of their full migration. They take off from this area in Colombia and they're flying straight up to Cuba or Florida, this area indicated in red here. So this combination of capture and recapture data and with tracking technologies becomes incredibly powerful. So that's all I wanted to show you today. I hope it's inspired some people to think about how we can really start to understand, where these critical stopover areas are. And I'll leave this slide up just a little while just to say thanks to all the people who have contributed to this body of work, which is now a list far too long to read off. And thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Nick. That was a wonderful presentation and yeah, really interesting stuff and a lot of food for thought. And yeah, definitely is going to make me think about some questions. So yeah, I'd like to open up the floor to any questions. You're welcome to put them in the chat or ask them here. Yeah, so anyone who has questions, step right up.
I can get us started. I have more of an applied question, I guess. Nick, if you could maybe talk a little bit about what's happening now that you've identified some of these key stopover areas, what's happening, work that's going on to try and conserve those areas.
Thank you, Elaine, for bringing that one up. I chopped those slides out to try to keep within time. So yeah, I mean, what's been really exciting for us, and thanks really to donors who have had so much faith in this process that we've been leading, is that we have been able to act almost immediately on these findings as they're coming in. So in a lot of those key areas across northern Colombia, we've been establishing native tree nurseries, and not with the view to actually restoring forests, trying to put forests back on the ground, but actually just enrich areas where we know birds are stopping over with trees that we also know that are providing food. So something that we've been doing as well with all these observations is actually, observing what trees birds are feeding in, which trees are providing more fruit, where birds are getting more insects. And then we are germinating those trees in the nurseries and then trying to get more of them on the landscape. So really trying to, just enrich habitats, particularly agricultural habitats where you have some trees but not many, with these trees that we know are providing food directly to birds.
All right, I can ask some of the questions in the chat again. Robert says, great presentation. Are there other metrics beside fuel loads that you have found to be useful in determining if a stopover area is an important stopover area for a migratory passerin?
Yeah, I mean, so for me, the gold standard, let's say, if you really want to be sure how birds are using a stopover site and it's really being used to fuel migration, then having capture, recapture data and being able to show that fuel loads or body mass is increasing, that is the best. But if you can't get that, and it's often the case, and it's, there's a lot of species that it's almost impossible to recapture them, or at least, recapture enough birds to get that kind of sample size. if you can find another way of just getting at stopover duration, that is an incredibly useful metric. Birds don't just stop at a site for 10 days because they feel like it. On migration, birds are under extreme time pressure. They're trying to get to either breeding grounds or non-breeding grounds quickly. So if they make a 10-day stopover, it's because it's got a critical function in their migration. So you can get at that with MOTIS tags, as I mentioned, coupling MOTIS tags with an on-site tower to just look at how long birds actually stay at a given site. It's incredibly simple, but actually very, very powerful way of getting information on how birds are using a given area. But if you've not got access to those kind of funds, then color banding birds is another way of getting stopover durations. If you're not recatching them, color band them and then go out and do resightings, and then you can run capture recapture models and again get a sense of that stopover duration. And if you can't get any of them, but you can catch the birds, then just looking at fuel loads is going to give you a sense of whether something is happening. It's not perfect, but at least it gives you part of the picture.
Great, thanks, Nick. Michael, did you have a question, or you good?
Yeah, Nick partially answered it, but I had a question about the potential for using something like color banding in eBird or something like that as a way to maybe kind of get more bang for your buck in terms of getting more observations on a stopover habitat site. But I think, Nick, you've kind of captured that already, so thanks.
Okay.
Okay, great. We can move on to the next question in the chat. Are these identified stopover sites on public, private, or already conserved land?
They are on a mixture, but a considerable percentage of them are on unprotected lands that are largely being used currently for farming. So, a lot of those areas in the Santa Marta Mountains, that area northeastern Colombia that you saw light up on multiple maps, that is a prime coffee growing region, particularly the elevations that migratory birds use. Much of the forest is already gone. There is a national park there, but it's higher up the slope. So, working with coffee farmers there and shade grown coffee in particular is obviously one way we can keep stopover habitat on the ground. But a lot of the lowland areas, particularly in Colombia that we've highlighted, have been devastated, I think is really the only fair word to apply. A lot of that was tropical dry forest. Tropical dry forest has lost 92% of its original cover in Colombia, and that applies to those areas across the Caribbean coast. And so, there is an urgent need to put that habitat back on the landscape. And, we think about species like yellow-billed cuckoo, willow flycatcher. They're really heavily using that habitat on stopover and also in particularly for willow flycatchers. And, we're seeing the concurrent declines in them. So yeah, there's some good news, but there's a lot of work to be done to really keep good stopover habitat on the landscape.
Okay. Jen has a really interesting question. I'm wondering, when you're looking at the fuel loads, if you've encountered birds in low quality areas acquiring not enough fuel for migration that did not make it to the winter areas, kind of predicting fatality based on low fuel loads and low quality sites.
So this is the study I am absolutely dying to do. So we published a paper back in, I think it's 2018, I can't remember. We looked at Tennessee warblers. And again, it was in the Santa Marta Mountains in northern Colombia. And we looked at birds using forest versus the shade coffee. And in the case of Tennessee warblers, in the forest, they were doing very well. They were fueling up quickly. But in the coffee, some birds were basically just flatlining. They weren't really gaining body mass, and those that did gained it at a very slow rate. And we hypothesized that, that could potentially lead to increased mortality in birds leaving from the lower quality habitat, simply because they wouldn't have enough fuel to make it to the next land. So when you take off from that part of Colombia, you have to fly across the water unless you want to go south and then west and then up through Panama. I mean, it's just, the obvious route if you're going north is across the ocean. And, based on our estimates of flight range, individuals in the shade coffee had a reasonable probability that they would run out of fuel over the Caribbean and would die. But we obviously have not been able to show that. But with MOTIS and the coverage of MOTIS now, it's the kind of question we can start to get at. And, a couple of people mentioned this earlier, that obviously detections in MOTIS aren't perfect. You can't be sure that no detection is a fatality. But if you start to incorporate that data into standard kind of survival models, you can start to estimate those parameters and obviously have a sense of, the amount of error around whether, there is actually mortality or not. So for me, it's a critically important question that we need to look at. There's not really been studies that have looked at these dichotomous habitats or areas where we know there's very distinct differences in the ability of birds to fuel, and then look to see what happens next. The paper that Valentina mentioned by Camila Gomez, where she looked at the pace of migration on leaving stopover sites of different quality, that gives a sense. It showed very clearly that if you're in a poor fueling habitat, your migration can be up to 30 days slower in terms of getting to the breeding grounds. But there's no mortality component in that. And I certainly have felt for a long time that stopping in suboptimal stopover habitat potentially can have fatal consequences, especially when you're facing a barrier like the Gulf of Mexico or the Caribbean Sea, or if you're a black pole over the Atlantic Ocean. It just seems to make logical sense when you think about it, that could be a large source of mortality for birds when stopover habitats are degraded.
That's really cool. Okay, I'm going to take advantage of the lack of questions in the chat to ask a question. I think when you were talking about using MODIS towers to look at stopover duration, you were talking about having like a single tower at a site. But I remember seeing a talk you gave a couple years ago about using multiple local towers to kind of look at local movements or habitat use. And I'm just curious what you see as kind of the advantages of having multiple towers at a single site versus just one, especially because,
Sure.
MODIS towers are expensive. So like what is the added information you get?
If you can, it's always better to have multiple towers. And obviously it's a trade-off between cost and just data quality, because motor stations sadly have their issues. They don't record data. Sometimes there's often things happening, so having backup station that's recording the same data is definitely a big advantage. It's certainly several times we've found it's saved a study for us having more than one station at a given site. But it's also in part about how well you can cover a given site with one station. So if you're working in an area that's topographically complex, mountainous or whatever, then having several stations covering that site is going to give you a much better chance of following those birds on a day-to-day basis, and being sure of being able to differentiate between birds genuinely leaving, having a very clear departure signal, which is one of the really neat things that I love about MOTIS, is that the departure signal you get when birds take off is unique and very clear, and that's something you don't get from other tracking technologies. We actually know the second, the minute that a bird took off from a given site. And so, you can differentiate between that and what might be a mortality event on stopover as well, because if the bird's actually predated, you're going to get a very different signal versus to, when a bird takes off. So, that's the other advantage. So, yeah, if you can put more, and something that's really important to mention when you're doing these local studies, you're not necessarily trying to contribute to the wider MOTIS network, is use shorter antennas. So three-element antennas have a much broader detection range. They don't cover as much distance, but that doesn't matter if you're trying to cover a relatively localized patch of a habitat. Whereas the big 9-element antennas that a lot of people will see on the classic image of a motor station, they are for detecting birds at a long distance, but they have a very narrow detection range along that detection beam. So they don't cover a given area of habitat as well as a shorter antenna. So that's something really important to think about when you want that information from birds at your study site, that you may want to combine if you've already got a station with long antennas, put some short ones on as well.
Super interesting. Sarah?
I have a question. So I've known Nick for a few years, and I know that he's a big thinker. So Nick, in light of the formation of this group and trying to reach partners across the hemisphere, what are you most excited about this group, or what maybe questions we could rally around, or how we could come together on some projects or big questions, or I don't know if you've thought about that at all, so I hate to put you on the spot. But I know that you're constantly thinking about large scale things and just curious what your thoughts are.
Um, yeah. There are still so many questions out there to answer. It's very difficult to kind of pick, specific questions, species, areas that, I think we should focus on. Um, but I do strongly believe there's just a lot of basic groundwork that needs to be done. Stopover biology in particular remains relatively understudied. And I'm just still amazed when you look at something like that bay-breasted warbler example. Why are there not 2 or 3 papers about this, crazy concentration of bay-breasted warblers in the Southern Alps and part of the Midwest, in one part of the year? It's just like you feel like people should have seen that and thought, oh, I'm going to go out and capture them and see what's happening. Just like, Nisbet and others did with the blackpoll warblers back in the 50s and 60s. People just saw these things and thought, oh, we need to study that. This. And yet and I think there's just so many examples like that within the continental US and Canada that, you'd think are the better studied areas relative to the neotropics. And yet I still feel there's huge holes there. But to answer your question a bit more directly, I think there's a huge amount of value from, multi organization collaborations or multi institutions across a given species breeding or wintering range, and also, particularly thinking about these questions related to habitat quality, whether it be on stopover sites or non-breeding areas or on the breeding grounds. And it's only when we start to do this at scale and we have, multiple partners working across different regions, can we start to get a sense of how much variation actually exists in the system and what local variation we're observing actually means. And those, the same kind of projects, whatever tracking device you're employing on birds, has the potential to start to inform us, obviously, about, migration routes, migration speed after leaving these given areas, and potentially about survival, which, I think it's just such a critical piece that we are still only just beginning to peel away the very first layers and understand, where birds might be dying across the annual cycle and where these bottlenecks in survival actually impact in population demographics. And that's the critical question. And I think it's going to take us a while to get there, but it's those kind of large scale collaborations that will give us the data to work with that will actually enable us to begin to answer those questions for 1 or 2 species and then hopefully the wider community.
Thanks.
Okay, I should have said this earlier, but as we said, part of the point of this group is to build connections and meet people. So a couple more questions are in the chat, but if you would prefer to ask your question yourself, and when you do that, introduce yourself and say, what organization you're from, if you want to, feel free to do that, because part of this is trying to get to know each other and think about potential collaborations. Not to put you on the spot, but Jorge, I don't know if you want to ask your question. I'm happy to also.
Sí. Hello, Nick. I'm gonna ask in Spanish. Hola, Nick. Muy buena presentación, muy informativa. Yo tenía una pregunta sobre lo que está pasando con la variabilidad climática. Y pues tenemos grandes sequías y ahora estamos viviendo también como unas temporadas de lluvias muy fuertes. Y pues todos también estos huracanes, etcétera, también pues tienen que ver un poco con la afectación en la migración y pues aquí en Sudamérica también puede estar provocando algún efecto sobre la disponibilidad de de alimento. Entonces, no, lo único que quería saber si esto sabes o se está teniendo en cuenta también en estos estudios que nos muestras y cómo está cambiando a lo largo del tiempo esto y cómo puede estar afectando también pues esa ecología de la migración.
No, qué buen pregunta, Jorge. Em, pues sí, yo lo veo como una pregunta crítico y que por lo menos en un contexto neotropical no contamos con la información suficiente para entender todavía cómo están esos impactos a largo plazo. Uno piensa en Norteamérica, obviamente hay observatorios de aves que tienen unos sets de datos que tienen más de 50 años, donde uno realmente puede empezar a investigar esas preguntas. Sin embargo, yo siento que algunos de los cambios más críticos van a ocurrir en el trópico, porque mucho de lo que estamos observando hasta la fecha eh, es que esas especies, o no todas, pero muchas, están aprovechando unos recursos estacionales, que es básicamente la vida de nave migratoria, ¿no? Lo que ellos hacen es que siguen recursos estacionales a lo largo de su vida, aprovechando donde hay una alza de recursos para reproducir, pero también impacta cómo organizan su migración. Y muchos casos como ese de la cetofaga striata, el Black Warbler, ahí en La Guajira, ellos tienen una ventana muy corta en que esas condiciones son aptas. Y si las lluvias no llegan antes del 15 de octubre en esa zona, cuando ellos llegan, pues simplemente llegan y no hay comida. Y lo mismo aplica con los catadores mínimos cuando están saliendo en Norte Colombia en primavera. L- la fruta que ellos consumen antes de cruzar el Caribe depende de las precipitaciones. En un año que las primeras lluvias llegan tarde, esos aves quedan ahí más tiempo y son mucho más demorados en, en engordar, en conseguir los recursos. Es que esa variación climática sí tiene un impacto, pero lo que no tenemos es los datos de largo plazo para poder decir que hay un patrón hacia arriba o hacia abajo o lo que sea que está impactando. Pero el supuesto es que, claro, pues una sequía como tuvimos este año no solo en Colombia, sino en gran parte de Sudamérica, tenía que haber impactado la migración de muchas especies.
Great. Okay, we have a question from Nicole in the chat. Nicole, do you feel like asking it? Okay, if not, I can ask for Nicole. Congratulations on the presentation. What advice could you give us to be able to apply everything you explained in Bolivia? Your entire presentation has been a great motivation that I would like to be able to apply in my country.
So I'd say the first step is start with the basics. Don't dive in with Motus tags, with trying to capture birds. I think, if you think in the context of Bolivia, it would be, okay, so what are the species that are moving through Bolivia or spending the non-breeding season in Bolivia? And what do we need to know about them? And that more than likely is going to be a case to start with, is just where they are. And so, I think starting with the basics, starting with surveys at a regional level across different habitats, across different precipitation gradients, that is really the first step to kind of moving forward. And as Ken has just posted, yeah, cuckoos, yellow-billed cuckoos particularly, but also black-billed cuckoos, and Connecticut warblers are two species that are kind of on the top, high up on the list of species we need to know more about in Bolivia. There's some great work being done by Mary Whitfield's group and others who have been actually getting into on the ground in Bolivia now and starting to collect some super important data about yellow-billed cuckoos. But there's a lot more. There's a lot more to be done in that sense. So that would be my recommendation. And then when you start to identify concentrations, whether it be non-breeding sites or whether it be stopover sites, is then think about, these next steps. Then think about collecting data from captures, maybe think about tagging birds to get a sense of, what happens after they leave these areas, among others. But I think, breaking it into pieces is the key. Don't try and take it all on at once. It's a very much an organic process where, as you get one piece of information, it leads to a question, which leads to, the next stage of the study. And the key is knowing what tools you have to answer each stage of that as you kind of drill down from the macro level down to the individual behavior of a given bird.
Great, thank you, Nick. Wendy says also olive-sided flycatcher in Bolivia.
Good luck catching.
All right, so we have about 10 minutes left, a little more. Yeah, we can still spend that 10 minutes doing more questions and feel free to raise your hand and ask questions. And they can be for Nick or for Valentina or more general questions or also input about this group and kind of after this first session, like where folks would like to see it go, suggestions for other topics that people are interested in.
I'll just chime in to say that if people are nervous about speaking up or putting things in the chat, please fill out the Google form. We've linked to it a few times, and maybe we can put it in the chat again. But really, the Google form will include your contact information so that we can gather emails for everybody who's here today and wants to remain involved with the group. And also, it allows you to fill out, topics that you want to talk about and explore in the future. One thing I love about this group is that, we have asked folks to co-chair it who are just really great at making a welcoming and open environment. That was very important to us. And so please share your thoughts. We want your help in building this group and helping to make it as useful to you as possible. It's kind of the priorities of this group will be determined by those who show up. And I think that that's very important. So we're very happy to see so many people on today. And lots of our partners that we have not seen on calls before. I'm so glad that we were able to have interpretation and welcome our Spanish speaking partners. So please fill out the Google form and let us know what you think to help us chart the path forward. But if you have thoughts now, you're welcome to chime in.
I've got one question for Nick. Actually, I was really interested by your slides and your when you were speaking about high occupancy areas that you were identifying through, I think, eBird data and radar data, and I was and using that to identify important stopover sites. And I was wondering if you had also used that as a tool to select strategic sites for MODIS stations, or whether you think that could be a good way to choose MODIS station sites that are going to give you a high return on data.
When I think about motor stations, I tend to think more about just where you have a high volume of birds migrating through, and that doesn't always overlap with where certain species are actually stopping over. I think there's definitely there's areas on the Caribbean coast of Costa Rica, for example, where, you have a whole community of birds stopping over. I think, but when you start to perhaps, look at it at the community level, yes, I think it may be a way to guide where you put motor stations. But obviously, I mean, for me, what would be even better is to have radar data. If you have radar data across a region, you really start to get a sense of where the highest volumes of birds are moving, and therefore where you can have effective motor stations. And I think of an example here in Colombia. The Magdalena Valley is not particularly used for stopovers. It's a lot of rice, it's a lot of dry forest. It's been largely degraded, but as a migratory flyway, it's phenomenal. And so from radar data, we've been seeing that. From nocturnal recorders, we've been seeing that. And now we have a motor station up there, and it's doing pretty well. And it's had like 14 common nighthawks this year already, 5 swains and thrushes of Eries. It's a station that's really moving. And so, there's a big difference between what actually happens on the ground often and what's happening in the air. And there can be a certain disconnect. So it's kind of, I think, combining those sets of information is more reliable when we think about station placement.
Thanks. That's super helpful.
Ellen, I don't know if you want to answer Jen's question in the chat, or Sarah.
Yes, sure. So the question was about the difference between the two subcommittees that we discussed, the Migration Connections and Migratory Ecology subcommittees. And so the Migratory Connections group that came together, it was really project-based, so focused on doing an analysis using eBird data to show by BCR where there are the greatest connections between the breeding and non-breeding geographic areas. And so there was a technical report that was produced out of that, and hopefully soon a peer-reviewed publication. So that group just came together specifically to work on that one particular project. So it essentially doesn't exist anymore. And the idea was that we could move from there into this broader migratory ecology subcommittee now to kind of keep some of those conversations and themes going.
Thanks, Ellen. Wendy?
Thanks, Anna. Can you hear me? Okay. I just wanted to take a moment to thank the presenters for taking the time and their thoughtful presentations, especially when you've had a rough week, which I can understand myself. For the working group, our new working group leads, which I too, like Sarah and Ellen have said, I'm super excited about the initiative and your enthusiasm and where you guys are going to take this. And also to our PIF Science leads, Sarah and Alan, for helping to structure and organize this. I really appreciate it. I would also echo Sarah's note it is a very welcoming group. Don't ever feel like you can't put your hand up and initiate, reach out to one of the partners, maybe a new colleague that you've seen online, fill out the Google sheet. I think this is super exciting. And I guess I'll just say, finally, one last note. I'm thinking a lot about one of our Canadian Wildlife Service colleagues and a co-author to many of the folks here, Dr. Keith Hobson, who unfortunately passed away recently, far too young. But he would be thrilled at this group. And also he was a great mentor to many of us that are on this call, young and old. So this is how it starts. So don't be shy, reach out, look out, ask for help. Yeah, I think this is a really exciting opportunity. So I look forward to where you guys are going to take it. And thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Wendy. Yeah, we have one more sort of comment in the chat that I can read out right before we close. Yuli, I don't know if you want to read this yourself.
Oh, hola, ¿me escuchan?
Sí.
Bueno, lo haré en español. Muchas gracias por este espacio y me alegra mucho ver cómo a todos organizando este nuevo comité. pues yo he trabajado con Selva ya desde hace algún tiempo y lo que nos ha funcionado también es todo el aspecto de capacitación. Entonces, me gustaría mucho que empiecen también como a pensar y a fomentar como todo este tema de capacitaciones, porque si vamos a empezar a hacer estudios que son tan valiosos y vamos a tener como muchas relaciones y que todos trabajemos juntos, también como estandarizar la forma en cómo vamos a hacer las cosas, me parece muy valioso. Entonces, como comenzar a fomentar como espacios en línea, presenciales, para poder hablar de cómo se montan las estaciones o, no sé, sobre alineamiento, sobre colocación de radiotransmisores, incluso como el análisis de estos datos, me parece que sería también como muy valioso de empezar a trabajar. Muchas gracias.
Gracias, Yuli, por este comentario. Muy de acuerdo. Y yo sé que tú nos has apoyado en el tema de capacitaciones en Guatemala. Entonces, sí, espero que a través de este grupo podemos organizar más capacitaciones. Y creo que es una buena idea pensar en capacitaciones en línea para personas que no pueden viajar o porque no podemos alcanzar a tantas personas en persona, pero sí, una combinación de en línea o en persona sería bueno. Y bienvenida a dar ideas sobre específicos temas y ubicaciones en Latinoamérica. Yeah, and I just want to say, kind of going off of that, that it's so exciting to see people here from all across the Americas, from so many different organizations. As we mentioned, the co-chairs are all from different organizations and regions. And I think one of the really exciting possibilities of this group is really developing some more of these broad big projects, like the wood thrush tagging project that Sarah and Nick and probably others on this call are involved in. I think expanding those kind of projects to other species and questions is, yeah, this is just a really great group of people to try to develop some of those collaborations. So yeah, please stay involved, keep coming, share your ideas, and just to harp on again, please fill out the Google form so we can keep track of you all. I don't know if Amy or Maya, Fabi had to leave a little bit early, but I don't know if Amy or Maya want to say anything before we close out.
Just to say thank you again to everyone for attending. It's really great to see such a large turnout. So yeah, I was really happy to hear that. And a huge thank you to Valentina and Nick for presenting today and sharing their knowledge with us. It was really interesting. Yeah, so hope to see you all again. And yes, thanks and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks all.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you so much, Nick and Valentina, and to Sarah and Alen for getting this started.
Absolutely.
It's so good. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Great job.
Thank you.
I guess just for the coordinators, we now have like 2 recordings because the recording stopped when Fabi left. I recorded mine to my computer because I'm not really sure about my Zoom account, so I can figure out where to upload that.
Yeah, we can figure out how to combine them somehow.
I know, we'll have to edit them together. I don't have a video editor, but yeah, we can probably just stitch those together. I will send the email of Elva to